Humidity. Now that's a problem in the winter. This morning when I woke up, this room had 21% humidity. It is 34% right now, which is still pretty low. My whole apartment has been pretty dry, and humidity is kind of tricky to get right. When you're growing orchids, ideally they want 50 to 60% humidity, but in the winter, that can be pretty tough. So in today's video, we're going to talk about when you need to increase your humidity, when you don't really need to, things you can do, and how I approach humidity with my collection of 200 orchids and about 50 Hoyas and growing. If you like this kind of video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more orchid content. Let's jump right in. Okay, so why is humidity important? Well, orchids grow naturally in the wild in very hot, usually humid conditions. And if they grow in cooler conditions, those conditions are usually cooler and humid. Think of the cloud forests of Ecuador, the cloud forests of Colombia. Think of not Medellin, but Bogota. It's kind of a cold city, but it's kind of humid. So I don't grow those orchids because I can't replicate that climate. But anyway, I digress. Let's talk about humidity. Orchids are epiphytes, so they grow in their native climates and they're used to soaking up lots of humidity. If you live in South Florida, for example, you're going to get way more humidity than we get up here in New York. So I can't grow orchids outside, number one, because of the temperature, number two, because of the humidity. It's just too dry. The ideal range of humidity is usually recommended at 50 to 70%. But for any orchids like cattleyas or dendrobiums that are sympodial or have multiple structures, I find that that's not as important. But for anything like a phalaenopsis, which I believe is monopodial, I'll write it down below. I'm looking at my files right now. Those are more sensitive because they don't have storage units. So how do we get the humidity up? So what do we need? The guidance is normally 50 to 70% humidity, but I mean, that seems kind of high and that's a little hard to get, but we could make some changes, right? I feel like cattleyas are fine, 30 to 40% humidity, and it really doesn't matter, but it's other orchids like masdevallias and things that I don't grow as much that really require it. Vandas require more humidity. Check out my Vanda video right here. They need lots of moisture and they need lots of air. So number one, I would say, is you have to start with watering your collection properly. In the winter, they still get plenty of water. I water about once a week. Some of the smaller pots, I water more often. I water it, I let it dry, and then I water again. So when you have lower humidity conditions, you don't want everything to stay dry for a very extended period of time because they're not getting that humidity. So the first thing you can do to address humidity is just make sure that you're watering properly. Now that doesn't control the air, but it controls the environment near the roots. And that's very important, particularly for vandas or any orchids that are more sensitive to humidity. Hygrometers can track the humidity during the day, but humidity tends to fluctuate. If you have a radiator nearby, it's going to suck out a lot of humidity. So in this room, I don't turn on my radiator and it's still quite warm in here. It is 76 degrees, so it's still pretty warm. But it'll fluctuate, so you can monitor it and see how it's doing, what you need. And in the winter, it just tends to be drier, at least here in New York City. So what can you do? Well, an orchid on its own usually will be drier than an orchid surrounded by other plants and orchids. So you can group them together, and that kind of creates like a little tiny microclimate. Now again, it was very low humidity here. I hadn't watered in a week. There was no moisture in those pots. So, I mean, the microclimate kind of helps when your plants are properly hydrated. They're evaporating water a little bit. So that kind of helps. So you could group that's one thing to consider. And it works more for larger collections. Something else that you can do is you can mist your orchids. I tend to do this twice a day this time of year. So this is 35% humidity. This morning it was at 21%. I misted the collection 2 hours ago. There's still some lingering humidity, which is nice. I end up doing it twice a day, once in the morning and then maybe once in the later afternoon. And that helps. And that actually got the humidity up to 50 something percent right after I misted. So it's temporary, but what that does is it gets all of the aerial roots on all of these orchids. So I find that what suffers the most in the winter are roots that are exposed to the elements. So anything that's growing outside of the pot, those roots tend to dry out because it's just too dry. So by misting, I do it twice a day. I'm giving the room a humid boost. That'll help for a little while. Some people use humidity trays. I don't find them to be very effective, but they put a tray down with pebbles and pour water under, and it's supposed to evaporate and go up. I don't find that they create a meaningful humidity increase, and I have too many, so it's not very practical for me. I find what works more for me is to keep everything watered, and I inadvertently do it because I have saucers here. And some of the orchids, when I water, will hold a little bit of water in the bottom, and then that can kind of evaporate out into the air as it's drying. But I do find that I get a humidity boost after I've watered just because everything is more hydrated. You can also use a humidifier. So I have a Levoit humidifier right here on this table. I don't often turn it on. I feel like I don't need it too much because I have mostly cattleyas and I miss the orchids, but it could be very effective if you have a big humidifier. If you live in a country that's very dry, I know some folks are here watching from Finland, Norway. So we have challenging conditions to grow tropical plants. So you may consider investing in a larger humidifier. I'll link the one that I use down below. You can use anything you want, but I would avoid a tiny one unless you have it in an enclosed space. So if you have like a little greenhouse setup, those small ones will be effective because the humidity is trapped. But if you have a small humidifier in a big room, it may not get everything. So the bigger, the better, in my opinion, for the humidifier, something with a big chamber that could spread the mist pretty far out. Now, in terms of this humidifier that I have, I could get the humidity to 60, 65% in this room if I close the door. If I leave the door open, the humidity will just kind of leave. I'll get it to about 45, 50%, which is still double than what it was. Sometimes a little more depending on the day, but if you close your room, but make sure you have a source of air. I have a fan in the corner here constantly running. That's very important because you don't want anything stagnant. And if you create too humid of an environment, even in the winter, you could get fungal infections and that sort of thing. Now, what are the benefits of higher humidity? Well, this time of year, orchids are prone to loads of spider mites. If it's too dry, you're going to get more pests. By increasing the humidity, they don't really latch on as easily, so that's a huge benefit. Those aerial roots will get some moisture as well if you have the humidity higher. I just find that they desiccate very easily if they're not being sprayed. If you don't really water them, when the humidity is super low, they dry, and the new growths, if it's growing outside of a pot, those tend to struggle. So something to keep in mind. Like I said, cattleyas and dendrobiums, they don't really need it as much, but you'll start noticing that if you have higher humidity, you'll have less bud blast on some of your orchids. So if you have a drastic change in your humidity, I notice that a lot of the Phalaenopsis, some of them drop their buds. So keeping the humidity may even help with keeping the flowers longer, preventing bud blast. That's at least what I've noticed. But the most important thing is making sure you have consistency in your temperatures. Something else that you can do, I don't do this, but you can create like a little IKEA greenhouse or a situation like that, especially if you have collections that really require high humidity, that for those monopodial orchids. And then you can add those little smaller humidifiers and enclose the space. That helps a ton. You could do like a little terrarium. Again, I just have so many that I just don't. I don't, but maybe one day, for if I ever decide to get harder to grow orchids, maybe I'll do it. When you're thinking about humidity, usually I find that I only really mist as often in the fall and winter. I don't do it at all in the summer, and in the spring, the humidity kind of turns up. So think about seasonality with the humidity. This is a time of year when it's worse, so I will mist twice a day. I don't mist at night because I don't want anything to be stagnant. And when the lights are off, the moisture might stay in crowns, encourage rot. So I try to do it while the lights still have a couple of hours to go. So the latest I'll mist is around 3 p.m. Let me know how you guys manage your humidity. If you manage it at all, again, like I said, the dendrobiums and cattleyas, they don't really need it that much, but I do find that other kinds of orchids like vandas do appreciate higher humidity. And although it's not required, it helps. It helps especially if you have a lot of aerial roots. I think keeping your orchid collection properly hydrated is probably the most important thing that you can do. By watering the plants, you're creating a humid environment for the roots. It's a little less important for the leaves, but it's very important for the roots. But overall, I wouldn't say it's the biggest thing you have to worry about. It's nice, but as long as you keep your orchids hydrated, they're usually going to be okay. But misting, keeping the humidity up, provides optimal conditions that they'll get in the wild. They'll grow a little better. The flowers will last longer. You'll have less bud blast. And overall, this is what these orchids are used to. So you're kind of giving them a better environment. I still find that they can thrive without excessive humidity, but there'll be little things that you notice. Like sometimes when there's low humidity, you'll have a new growth that's kind of like tight inside of the growth, and it didn't really grow properly. That tends to happen, but it's not that common. The biggest thing is to make sure you take care of the hydration of your orchids. Anyway, guys, I hope this was helpful. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye, everyone.